All right, testing. Is everything working? Can you guys hear me? Can you guys see the screen? Let me make sure I have everything ready to go. All right, perfect. Let me see. Okay, perfect. I guess the panel is starting. Yeah, I guess I could start the panel now. Let me do a preview of everything. So I guess just get started. Let me link all my social media stuff so you guys are ready to go. So the website, and I just launched it literally hours ago, is Con History. This will be where I'll be posting information about the convention history book I'm working on, as well as all the information I'm going to be talking about on this panel. If you guys want to follow me, I'm going to link my social media here, including my Twitter accounts, which you can follow me on, or message me. My con store, where I have some exclusive merch specifically for this con and the summer events, as well as the YouTube channel, which I have the previous version of this panel on, and I'll be posting, as well as future stuff I'll be posting as well. And if you guys want to contact me for anything, like I'm sure we're going to have a lot of old school con folks here who probably want to correct me or add stuff to the information I'm going to present. I'm going to leave my email right here, so you guys can contact me at either email. And just to be safe, let me make sure I have everything linked and ready to go. All right, perfect. I think we are good to go. Welcome, everybody. This is the convention history panel from WorldCon to Comic-Con Online. So this is a panel I've been doing for a few years now. If you guys don't know too much about me, actually, let me introduce myself. Let's make sure the slides are working. And if you guys can't see the slides, I think if on this application, if the screen share, if the slideshow I'm showing seems to be a bit too small, you could click on it and it should make it larger. Oh, perfect. Yeah, I did this panel a few times in the past, so if you guys have been to that panel, great. Let's see if everything's good. Okay, so yes, I'm doing the convention history panel. A little bit about me. I've been working on this project for a few years now. You guys might know me in the fandom as Chocolate Pony or an Animorphs. I've been active in both the furry and pony fandoms, as well as comic and anime fandoms. I do a lot of cons. In fact, vending at cons is currently my full-time job. I've been vending at cons, doing cons for almost 10 years now. In fact, I hit my 100th con last year. And yeah, I do about 25 cons a year. I've been you could follow my work on Transformative, or you could also check out the con store where I have some exclusive merch for you Megaplex attendees. And yeah, Megaplex, I just moved to Orlando last December, so technically Megaplex is my local furrycon now. All right, and tomorrow I'll be doing the inanimate transformation panel. So if you guys are interested in the history of inanimate transformation in media and fiction and how it influenced the folks and artists in the furry fandom, be sure to check that out. So like I said, I've been working on the convention history book for a few years now. I think I started in roughly 2013. So a little bit about my background. I was a cadet officer in military academy, where I learned a bit about organizational skills and management, how to lead people. I went to Johns Hopkins University, where I studied genetic biology. And it was at Johns Hopkins where I kind of learned a bit about human psychology as well. I started to look at things from the perspective of evolutionary biology. So I liked looking at things as if they were growing organisms. And I'm also an artist. So like I said, I'm a professional artist. I vend at a lot of cons. I do a lot of concept work. So basically, all these different elements in my life combined together, which made the idea of researching a book on the history of America's fan conventions the next perfect step for me. I've previously written 2 books. The first book was on the history of the Japanese visual novel industry and medium, and the second book was a history on the military schools of America. What was unique about those 2 books and this current book is I was really the first to kind of tackle a vast history of subjects that never really had a full history written upon them. So, for example, there have been books written about conventions. People have written about their own fandom, but there's never been a book about the fan convention scene in general. So not just furry cons, not just comic cons, but all these conventions. Because as we know, these cons are not in a bubble. Each of these different fandoms and groups and industries influence each other. So I had to take a wider look at this entire. I wanted to take a wider look at everything and see if I could tie it together. So I originally tried to make this book a Kickstarter project. It wasn't funded, but that's fine because it gave me time to work on the book longer. I did a breakdown of the book at some past panels. So if you were at my panel at Anthrocon or FurFest last year, or if you dropped by the panels I did for the online events, Ponyfest Online and Comic-Con at Home, I did a chapter by chapter breakdown of the book. Of course, these are not finalized chapters because of how much things are changing, but I gave a kind of story by story breakdown of how I wanted to lay out this history. But since I basically recorded a nice version of that for Comic-Con and Ponyfest, I felt like I'll do something different for this panel at Megaplex. So if you guys want to follow up on that, if you guys want to watch that panel that I did where I broke down the book chapter by chapter, let me link it here. Hopefully it should link to the right video. So let's go to the next slide. So yeah, I've been working on this project for a while now. I've been promoting it in very different forms. I was originally supposed to be a small comic, and eventually I expanded it to be an entire history book. You guys might have seen some of these charts. Like I was saying, I studied evolutionary biology at Johns Hopkins. So from that perspective, I wanted to look at the history of how these conventions came about as if they were evolving like an organism. So I kind of made these family trees, tracking down different elements of different conventions that branched off and formed new conventions or became adopted by future cons. So this is one of the charts that I made. You could kind of see how I started with the science fiction cons here and the comic cons here, and how that kind of gave way to all these different cons along the way, including the furry and anime cons. This is I think a little bit of a cleaner chart that I'm going to be using for this panel. And we could kind of see how I have WorldCon here as well as some protocons, early cons, like the cons in Philadelphia and Leeds that were before WorldCon, and the comic cons, and how from the science fiction cons, we have general cons, which basically became the multimedia cons of today. We have science fiction cons that kind of stayed true to the roots and became the hard science fiction cons. And specifically from the science fiction con room parties, we got anime cons, furry cons, Trek cons, and brony cons. So all these different periods are going to be covered. So since the previous versions of this panel, I've done a chronological history, and the ones I was doing for last year were a chapter by chapter breakdown, I thought I would do something different for Megaplex to make it special. Since I felt like the previous ones, because I had to talk about all the little details and nitty gritties along the way, like what was happening in the comic book industry or the animation industry, for example, it took away from the focus of the history of the conventions themselves. So I decided for this panel, I would kind of broaden everything into vast eras and show elements of what occurred at a lot of these conventions and how they influenced later conventions and the modern cons, and everything in between. So this is my first time doing this version of the panel. So I hope you guys enjoy it. It's going to be different than what I've done in the past. So if you've seen it in the past, it's going to be slightly different. But with that, let's get started. Oh yeah, I see someone in the chat said that Purple Taker is at fault for BronyCon. Yes, I'll talk about the BronyCons later. But let's get started with the science fiction cons, because that's where we kind of see the roots of all of what we will call the modern convention scene. So the first 3 chapters of my book actually ask the question of what is fandom, what can be defined as a convention. I'm just going to really skirt over there by saying, if you really want to be kind of be specific, there is really no first convention, because while by my definition, what I would consider the first modern convention is a WorldCon. I've talked to a lot of old school science fiction fans, a lot of old guard con folks, who would like to argue the Philadelphia convention or the convention in Leeds were technically the first convention. But by that standard, I would go back and argue, well, we had Victorian fan meetups, Victorian literary saloons, and Victorian book clubs. So what would make those different than the one-day science fiction meetings that they were trying to argue were the first conventions? And even by that standard, how do those Victorian events differ from what we were doing all the way back at the dawn of civilization, when cavemen would be in circles around fire and listen to the stories that the shamans told, and each generation of shamans would do their own take on the stories that came afterwards, essentially creating their own fan fictions. So it's a very nebulous thing. As well, there's a lot of things which might fall into the definition that I have to leave out. So the World's Fair, state fairs, some people might call conventions. I'm not including them in this. I specifically am not including consumer trade shows as well. And again, it becomes rocky, because are Renaissance fairs considered conventions? If Renaissance fairs are included, does that mean medieval time fairs are included? Does that mean Civil War stuff are included, reenactments? So to make things simple, I'm going back to WorldCon. So while there is a lot of debate on the first convention, like I said, PhilCon was the first held in 1936, and Leeds was held a year following, but was technically announced before PhilCon. They were both gathering of science fiction fans, but they were more or less one-day events. They were essentially meetups. And my argument for what will be considered the first modern convention is WorldCon, and I'll explain it by the elements that it brought forth that have been since adopted by almost every single fan convention. And when I say fan conventions, I'm meaning conventions based around narrative art, pop culture. So in this definition, I'll include fans of properties that are based around comics, television shows, film, and animation, as well as video games and visual novels to a lesser extent. But what was unique about WorldCon, it was held in New York City in 1939, and it was held over July 4th weekend. So already we have an event that was not just a one-day meetup, it was a weekend event. It was held in a hotel. So this brings forth the model of a convention basically renting out a block of rooms, and attendees, instead of going home for the day, mingle around the hotel after the daily events are done. So the specific was the interaction between fans and guests in the industry. Now, what's unique around this time were basically there was really no hard divide between the professional industry and fans. Folks who were writing the science fiction stories of that day were also fans of the event. So there was really no hard distinction, but some professional industry folks will be designated a guest of honor, and most science fiction cons, and I guess furry cons still do this as well, normally have one guest of honor they honor at each event, even though they have a bunch of industry folks. This is going to be different than the anime and comic cons later that basically fill up the roster with these guest of honor. And WorldCon had about 200 attendees, so it was a really, really big attendance. And some would argue the first cosplay. So science fiction editor Forrest Ackerman, dressed in some futuristic gear, claimed he and his girlfriend were doing the first cosplay. And a lot of science fiction fans consider Forrest Ackerman being the first to do cosplay. So this is a period that took place in what's called the Golden Age of Science Fiction. Coincidentally, the Golden Age of Science Fiction and the Golden Age of American comics both can be pinpointed to around 1938. This was the start of Action Comics, which brought forth Superman, and this was the period when the big science fiction magazines really grabbed hold. So this is a period where the first early cons were held. Now, let me explain. When I say science fiction cons of these period, science fiction was a general catch-all term to include basically all pop culture and geek fandom. So science fiction cons were not just for fans of literature SF. It was also for fans of comics and radio shows and movies. So as opposed to now, when we hear the term science fiction, we think of it of one specific genre. We could essentially consider these science fiction cons of this early period as what we consider general or multimedia cons of today. So a lot of these elements that were brought forth from these early world cons and early science fiction cons include the concept of wearing badges around. You had badge ribbons that you could add to your badge. Room parties become a very, very big focal point of a lot of these science fiction cons, especially this is where, like I was saying, these science fiction cons were general conventions as a whole. So for fans of specific genres or franchises to find like-minded folks, they will normally join these different room parties. The concept of so programming tracks became really, really big with these early science fiction cons. In fact, the furry cons of today probably all got their start with the programming department, modeling them off the former science fiction multi-programming tracks. And this is kind of where you also get your first dealers. So as opposed to folks who specifically sell geek and pop culture things to the masses, these are probably folks who are reselling old books, old magazines, old comics, and old memorabilia. They weren't like the dealers that we kind of see today that are selling, collectible toys and Funko Pop figures. And back then, there wasn't really a concept of an artist alley. Most science fiction cons would have something called an art show, because we have to remember the artists who were going to these cons were folks who were painting big illustrations for covers and books. So they wouldn't really, as opposed to the later comic and anime cons, they wouldn't really have been able to mass produce their art in print form as posters to kind of sell en masse. So they'll normally just sell their original painting. So of course, the best way to do this would be to do an art show or an art auction. And furry cons, a lot of them do continue this tradition of an art show and an art auction to today. Now, as we move forward in time, we could break down. I'm going to highlight some major conventions and kind of what they added to the scene. So first we have WorldCon, which was first started in 1948. And WorldCon was a convention that was specifically meant to take place within North America. So WorldCon is kind of like the Olympics or the World's Fair, where every year the different groups from around the world get to vote on WorldCon, and the attendees of the con get to vote on the host city. And if they win, then they get to host a convention. So WorldCon can be hosted anywhere around the world. It's normally held in the United States, but it is allowed to be held outside the United States. Because of this, WorldCon specifically wanted to create a science fiction con that was held within North America. The year after that, we saw Midwest Con, formed in 1949. Which is considered the first Relaxicon. And the concept of a Relaxicon is kind of a casual event where it's just basically a big gathering of fans where there's no programming, really, or little programming. and it's focused mostly on meetups and parties. And we do see some relaxicons today, but they're not as common. The most of the relaxicons that still exist are these older science fiction events. Now, as we move forward, WorldCon will eventually start hosting what's known as the Hugo Awards. Hugo Awards were first started in 1953, and the Hugo Awards are kind of like the Oscars, the Academy Awards for the science fiction fandom, where this is probably the award you want to get if you are working within the industry. But what's unique about the Hugo Awards, as opposed to the Oscars or the Emmys, for example, is the Hugo Awards are only voted on by the attendees of that year's WorldCon. So, as opposed to having a panel of judges or the industry vote, it's voted on by the fans who are attending a specific convention. So, this is unique because it shows that these con attendees do have some pull within the industry if they get to have a big say in voting on the industry's top award. And we'll see this as we move forward, that the industry takes notice that these con attendees have such a big pool that they will eventually, these conventions and likewise their entertainment industries, you could see, will have a relationship back and forth with each other. Now, in a few years after that, we have a group called First Fandom, which is a group formed around fans who were involved with the around the time the first WorldCon took place. And we still have some folks who are involved with First Fandom still around today. And of course, during this period, we have the emergence of what's called folk music, which was a misspelling of folk in one of the con books. And folk music basically were just fans who will find an empty panel room, strumming a guitar and just riff and sing and make up songs about their favorite science fiction characters. So we kind of see the root of all convention music, starting with these wayfaring singers who would just make fan songs in empty panel rooms. And we kind of see that today. If you go to an empty panel room at like a science fiction con or a furry con, you'll still see folks who would just randomly take over that panel room and riff and make their own music. All right, so let's move forward to the next period. So the next period kind of enter both the science fiction industry and the comic industry enter two new eras. So science fiction enters what's called a new wave period, while the comic book industry enters what's called the Silver Age. So let's first start off with explaining what new wave is. So science fiction was kind of the catch-all term for both fantasy and hard science fiction around this time period. In retrospect, we call what this genre was speculative fiction. And what most people consider the split between speculative fiction into high fantasy and new wave science fiction is when J.R.R. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, specifically The Hobbit. It moved fantasy more towards solidifying the sword and sorcery style works, as well as pushing fantasy in a more escapist direction. While Michael Moorcock really didn't like the escapist tones that fantasy was taking on, as well as he wasn't really a fan of the escapist tones of the golden age of science fiction, where golden age of science fiction was more basically cowboys in space. We are a great and powerful race and will someday conquer the stars. Michael Moorcock was born in a period where he did not like this, and he wanted to create more subversive works where we would wind up in grim dystopian futures, heavily polluted if we didn't change our ways now. And with his New Wave magazine, he kind of pushed science fiction more towards that grim, gritty, subversive route. So that's where we kind of see a split in speculative fiction. On the other hand, a lot of comic book fans who were coming back from World War II didn't really want to see escapist fun superheroes. So a lot of the superhero comics shifted to being about horror comics or romance comics or giant monster comics. In fact, Marvel Comics, they call themselves Marvel because they were essentially a kaiju comic company around that time period, where things took a change is when DC Comics did Justice League, where they took some of their big name characters and made them on a super team together. That really inspired Stan Lee to try to do the same with the Avengers. But specifically, it was when DC did Flash of Two Worlds, which it reintroduced the multiverse, and Marvel did Fantastic Four and Spider-Man, all these works in 1961, that we really could consider the start of the Silver Age of comics. So likewise, this is where we're going to see the birth of the Comic Cons. So the first Comic Con, the first recorded Comic Con, was New York Comic Con, which was found in 1964. I think it went under a few different names, like the Comics Art Show for a period. I think it ended around the 1980s. And this New York Comic Con has no connection with the current New York Comic Con run by Reed Pop of today. The other big one that we had was Golden State Comic Con, which of course we now know as San Diego Comic Con. All right, and yeah, so during this period, we started seeing a bunch of Comic Cons take place. So let me talk about the different elements of these Comic Cons. So as opposed to the science fiction cons of the previous period, where it was basically, fans being fans, welcoming folks from the industry into their collective, the Comic Cons really were started by a lot of people who were reselling comic books and comic book art. So it was essentially founded by the dealers as a place to kind of sell their stuff. So it had more of a model of like a flea market around this time. It was just secondhand resellers. Now, to attract people to their convention, they wanted to bring on a bunch of artists who were working in the industry. Now, as opposed to science fiction cons that would try to bring industry guests on and basically promote them to being the guest of honor of these events, a lot of these Comic Cons didn't want to pay extra money to have to pay for these industry guests to come on board. So they basically allowed them to sell their art to make up for this fact in what's we now know as the Artist Alley. So basically, the first Artist Alley started with these early Comic Cons, basically wanting to have big name industry folks at their event, but don't want to call them community guests or guests of honor. So they created the Artist Alley where you could buy original artwork from them or get on-site commissions from your favorite comic book folks. Now, during this period, Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby, who were basically the two folks who basically created the Marvel universe. So Steve Ditko with Doctor Strange and Spider-Man, Jack Kirby with Thor, the Avengers, X-Men, Captain America, were very, very frustrated because even though they were the artists on these books, Stan Lee got a lot of attention, a lot of the credits, because especially within the European market where comics were considered an art form, most by European standards of art, the concept of a work of art being created as a collaborative effort was kind of frowned upon. So to justify, for example, cinema as being an art form, they brought forth the concept of auteur theory, where the director, even though films and movies are made up of a bunch of different actors, screenwriters, and cameramen and stuff, all the credit for the success and artistic merit of the film was normally always put on the hands of the director. Likewise, it was the writer within the comic book industry who got that. And specifically for Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby, this was seen as very, very unfair. Especially in a lot of Steve Ditko cases, he basically would draw the entire comic, leaving just the word bubbles empty. Then Stan Lee will come in and just fill in the word bubbles. He didn't even have a hand in the plotting of these scripts. So so of course they were frustrated and they left Marvel around this time. And this coincided with a period where we had the rise of underground comics, as opposed to people trying to break into the comic book industry. They're like, well, let's kind of work on our own stuff. And this mirrors the 60s counterculture movement. So specifically, the underground comics movement really got a hold in Austin, Texas, with a group known as the Texas Mafia, and in San Francisco. San Francisco specifically, you had Robert Crumb, of course, known for Fritz the Cat. Probably a lot of you old furries know about Fritz the Cat. And of course, we had the Air Pirates, who would do subversive take on Mickey Mouse and meet the ire of Disney. And this is a panel I do another kind where I talk about the copyright issue. But before then, you could more or less do your own fan comic on a lot of these copyright properties. And for the most part, the copyrights and franchise holders would not really do anything about it, because there's really an unspoken tradition within the writing world and the literary world, where it was fine for authors of works to riff on previous authors that came before. So, for example, Alan Moore famously talks about how his League of Extraordinary Gentlemen Nemo trilogy was inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft because he was following in this literary tradition. H.P. Lovecraft, of course, most famous for the Mountains of Madness. Mountains of Madness was essentially a fan fiction on a Jules Verne story called The Ice Sphinx. And Jules Verne, of course, is known as one of the fathers of modern science fiction. Jules Verne's The Ice Sphinx was actually a fan fiction of Edgar Allan Poe's narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. So each of these big name authors, who basically are the fathers of new genres, their big breakout work was essentially a fan fiction of a previous work that came before. So this was something that was kind of more accepted. It was after the Air Pirates basically got into the Disney radar that Disney pressed really, really hard for extending copyright laws, which is why the copyright law was called the Mickey Mouse Copyright Protection Act, because it was Disney who was really shoehorning this, which is why unless something is in public domain, you normally can't get that work. You're not allowed to do fan art or fan fiction or of these characters. In Japan, the copyright issues were kind of skirted on. So within Japan, you also had an underground comic movement, and Japan had a culture. Basically, it was called Dondinshi culture, based around donjin, which are basically short 10 to 20 page fan comics. Normally, 90% of it is smut and shipping. It's a lot of adult content. This is very similar to something that happened in America in the 1920s called the Tijuana Bible, where American artists would take popular comic book characters like Popeye or animated characters like Betty Boop or characters like Flash Gordon or Humphrey Bogart and do their own like 8-page smut comics of these popular characters. Japan basically did their own version of this with Dondinshi culture. And a lot of these Dondinshi circles became so big that they would want a place to gather and sell their stuff. And this is where we get the rise of Comic-Con. Comic-Con is currently the world's largest convention. It's 3 times bigger than San Diego Comic-Con and held 3 times a year. And it's essentially one giant artist alley. So as opposed to the large conventions that we see today, which are giant industry events where they do all these announcements and all these panels and all that have a show floor with a bunch of setups and display, Comic-Con is the largest convention and it's basically formed around artists just selling artwork at the table. And this is where we get the concept of the Comic-Con inspired artist alley. Now, notice I separate the difference between Comic-Con artist alleys and Comic-Con artist alleys because these are 2 different things that play a role later down the line. But Comic-Con artist alleys really were made up of folks who worked within the professional comic book industry. So these are people working on the official Batman and Spider-Man comics who are selling original art and commissions of works they were licensed to produce. On the other hand, the artist alleys at Comic-Con and the anime cons Comic-Con will inspire were essentially all fan fiction. While of course we did see original work emerge from these dungeon circles, most of them were fan comics, and they were not safe for work fan comics either. So that shows you the difference between the 2 artist alleys across the ocean. Now, this is why I kind of say Comic-Cons start a new branch, even though it's obvious they were inspired by the science fiction cons that came before. Science fiction cons got a lot more inspiration from different events. Like I said, these were gatherings of fans who were inviting the industry into their abode. And Comic-Cons were essentially formed by people who are working with industry and inviting fans into their event. So very, very different cores if you really want to think about it. And one, the science fiction cons that started in Japan and Comic-Con, both of those would essentially go on to form the anime cons as we know them today. But both the science fiction, you could kind of see Comic-Cons now entering the scene as a completely different new branch as the science fiction con scene starts branching off into different directions. All right, so so I'm going to talk about 2 franchise specific fandoms. Of course, I'm going to talk about anime fans, comic fans, and furries in the book, and in this panel as well. But there are two franchise-specific fandoms who really get a big nod when it comes to this, because it's specifically because the impact they have left on the convention scene. The first, which I'm going to talk about now, are the Trekkies, and the second are going to be the Bronies, which I'll talk about later. But let's talk about the Trekkies first. So Star Trek was first promoted at WorldCon, so we're already seeing that people knew that these conventions were the place to go to. So of course, Star Trek was going to be promoted there. The first Star Trek convention, Star Trek Lives, actually had 3,000 attendees, and that it's crazy because we think of 3,000 attendees as large for a pony convention or large to mid-size for a furry convention of today. But the first Star Trek con already had 3,000 attendees, 6,000 attendees by the next year, and then the year after that, it had 15,000 attendees. In fact, it was so big that 600 attendees had to be turned away at the door. So because Star Trek cons, Star Trek fandom became really, really big around this time. Star Trek panels and events really started dominating the science fiction con scene. And because of this, science fiction cons brought on by Trekkies introduced the concept of what's called multi-track programming. So before this time, the programming and events at these cons normally always were just one panel. There's just one panel room, and there was one panel happening. So everyone basically went to the same panel. With the rise of Trekkies becoming popular and dominating the panel scene, a lot of people didn't want to go to these Star Trek panels. So the concept of multi-track programming, where you have different panels simultaneously happening, started becoming adopted and became popular. Of course, today we attendees would think that's odd. We would think that our current way of doing programming and events as completely normal, but it took the science fiction fandom like a few decades before they finally were like, instead of just having one panel at a time, maybe let's just divide the panels up. So we have multi-track programming, and so while I would say there were every fandom is radical. Like if we want to say that, like the Sherlock Holmes fandom was radical, Jane Austen fandom was radical. I think Trekkies kind of get unfair treatment for being seen as the radical virgin man children no life fan base, when every fandom has these types of individuals. Specifically, why the Trekkies were kind of stamped and branded with this negative connotation was because the Star Trek fandom occurred around the time when more local broadcast media and news stations started emerging. So of course, whenever there was a Star Trek convention in town, a local news station will want to go there, and then of course they're going to see a bunch of people dressed up in colorful outfits and cosplay. And of course, they're going to record them and mock them. So Trekkies got a lot of unfair recognition, but because of this, they also popularized a lot of stereotypes we associate with fandoms. So like I was saying, cosplay was happening since the first WorldCon, but really the popularity of cosplay around canon works and franchises really got popular with Star Trek fandom. The Star Trek fandom also popularized the concept of slash fiction, or basically romantic fiction between canon characters in the show. Shipping and pairing became really, really big. Shipping and pairing specifically normally had characters who were not romantically involved in the canon work, but were in these fan headcanons. And normally these were same-sex attractions as well. The popularity of fanzines got really big around this time. And of course, the idea of concept of self-insert fan fiction, which we now know as Mary Sue, got popular around this time. So we started seeing a break off of a bunch of different conventions. So Gen Con was one of the first major tabletop gaming convention, broke off from the science fiction con scene around this time. We had Creation Con, which started to run a lot of these early Star Trek cons. And Creation Con is what most people consider the first pro con. So now we kind of divide cons up nowadays between, you know, professionally run for-profit conventions and volunteer fan-run conventions. And Creation Con is one of the first cons that took the professional model, as a lot of people like to say. And this is when the Star Trek and science fiction cons started rebranding as General Con. So, of course, the Star Trek show ended. So a lot of Trek cons started seeing dwindling attendance, and to appeal themselves to more people, they started rebranding themselves as general fandom events. And like fiction cons of this era were essentially the general con, but because science fiction was now having a unique connotation with a specific industry. Even though they didn't really change formatting, they basically rebranded themselves as General Con so they could attract fans from a lot of different properties around this time. So not just within the science fiction fandom, but the comic book fandom and animation fandom as well. Around this time, the term gopher was coined. Short for it's a word for volunteer, because they would go fetch or go for something. Of course, the term Trekkie was coined around this time as well, and this is also where we see the North American Science Fiction Convention, which was founded in 1975. It was specifically to be held in the United States when WorldCon didn't take place. So kind of like WesterCon, the idea was to keep a WorldCon like event in the United States when WorldCon wasn't held. So, for example, this year WorldCon was supposed to take place in New Zealand and the year before it took place in Dublin. During those years when WorldCon does not take place in the United States, the North American Science Fiction Convention takes place. This is also where we see the formation of con volunteer security forces. So if anyone's ever done any cons in the San Francisco Bay Area, so I believe Further Confusion and BabsCon are there, you would see Flare, which are a group of volunteer security. And this is also around the time when the word cosplay was coined at WorldCon.
Hey, in Animorphs, I don't know if you can hear this or not, but it seems like I think he's gone right now. Sorry, I'm the moderator of this panel. But in Animorphs, if you're hearing this, we couldn't hear you, and your panel slideshow stopped displaying. But I'll be here to entertain until he comes back. So, yeah, Trekkies and sorry, I'm trying my best. I didn't expect this to happen. I guess none of us did. But right, I'm okay. And Animorphs, try refreshing your page, and I guess unplugging your microphone and plugging it back in. Weird. Sorry, I'm. Huh. Okay. He's gonna reconnect. Just hang tight, everybody. And thank you for your patience. Well, don't forget to donate to our charity, the Care Foundation. All right.
All right. Am I back?
Yes, you are back. Perfect.
Okay.
Everybody else can see?
Yeah, can you guys see the slides? I'm curious, where did I leave off before I got disconnected?
Trekkies.
Trekkies. Okay. I don't know how much I missed, but the Trekkies were the ones that kind of shifted things towards a more general con model. And we started seeing a lot of evolution of different things like con volunteer groups, and the term gopher being coined around this time basically is, I guess, to catch up. We entered what's known as the dark age of comics, brought on by works like Watchmen, Mouse, and Dark Knight Returns. Watchmen wins a Hugo Award for Best Other Forms. Later on, Sandman wins award for World Fantasy Best Short Story. These were both controversial because Watchmen could only win by a 1 year created category called Other Forms. And after Sandman won award for Best Short Story, I think comics were banned from being entered from this category. So to counter that, the comic fandom and comic book scenes wanted to host their own awards. So San Diego Comic Con started hosting what's known as the Kirby Awards, which were later split into the Harvey and the Eisner Awards. And I think that's basically what we need to know. Let me see, how much time do I have? Let me kind of rush through some of this stuff. So yeah, so we started to see these general cons being formed, and cons, science fiction cons that kind of remained hard science fiction, moved onto their own path, while general cons started absorbing what will be known, what the comic cons are, to become eventually multimedia cons. But we're more interested in this period right here with the room parties coming out of these conventions. So a lot of these conventions would have science fiction cons would host room parties, and we let me see. So this furry cons continue this tradition from science fiction cons. So I'm sure you furries will be more aware of this than anime or brony con folks that I talk with. But most science fiction cons and furry cons have a room party bulletin board in the lobby of the hotel, and these room party bulletin boards would host different parties. Specifically, they would also have they would focus on specific fandoms. So, like I said, a lot of these cons were broad in general. So, if you wanted to find fans of Doctor Who, someone might say, "Oh, I have a Doctor Who room party happening at 8 p.m. room 802 in the Marriott. Come join." So two specific groups started becoming really big around this time. You had fans of what's known as Japanimation, which we now know as anime, and we had fans of anthropomorphic characters. So we'll start with the first group. The first group, the anime fans, got so big that they were like, hey, we could probably form our own groups. So anime cons started forming in the early 90s. YamatoCon, a lot of people say, might be the first anime con. It was founded in 1983, but it was a one-day college event. A-Con is widely considered the first American anime con. And these early anime cons basically adopted the Comic Cat model of having an artist alley. So it'll be fan-run artist alleys full of fan art and fan-run multi-programming tracks. They would also introduce a lot of Japanese-inspired cosplay contests. Cosplay contests, of course, were big with science fiction cons, but Japan brought another level of cosplay to America. And Japanese-style raves and concerts became introduced to these cons. Then we have, of course, we're the fandom that most of you folks in this at this event are here for, the anthropomorphic fandom, which grew from a lot of these anthropomorphic animal zines in the 70s and 80s. All of a sudden we started seeing, like we're saying with the anime cons, fans of anthropomorphic animals wanting to form their own room party. So of course we have one of the first ones being held at WesterCon, host an anthropomorphic room party. The year, this was even before the fandom had a name, because it took a year before the fandom started calling themselves furries, and the term furry party was used to describe these anthropomorphic room parties. And these furry room parties would be so big, they would go on to, they were like, hey, we could do our own conventions, and they did. So Conference was considered the first furry convention in 1989. It was founded by the same host of these early room parties at WesterCon. And unlike anime cons, which basically adapted a lot of models from the Comic Cat model, FurryCon stayed really, really true to the science fiction model they extended from. So FurryCons adopted the reduced room rate model that a lot of science fiction cons had, as opposed to anime cons that like staying in convention centers. A lot of these FurryCons like staying within the hotel and using the hotel amenities. The FurryCons also brought over the multi-programming track that the sci-fi cons have. In fact, you will see if you go to a lot of older furry cons and you see a lot of Grey Muzzleds and Old Guard staff, a lot of them also got their start in science fiction con scenes. And of course, they kept the room party stuff. Yeah, and I think someone's talking about the con book cover for conference, and yeah, it's a really nice one. The term fursuit was, of course, was coined later, and then we had WorldCon starting their own furry lounge, and of course the two big cons, Anthrocon and First Fest, formed later. Now, similar to the Trekkies, this was a time when furries were also seen as odd and unique. So, of course, the media would come to these furry cons and kind of mock the furries, and this brought on one of two things. One, as opposed to the Trekkies that tried to just, wear it as a chip on their shoulder and grin and bear all the harassment they were kind of taking from the public, the furry cons started to isolate themselves and basically bar media from entering. In fact, a lot of these old furry cons, there are rules in the con book that saying you couldn't really take pictures, you couldn't give pictures to the media, you couldn't talk to media. If you were caught talking to media, you'll be banned from the con. If you secretly invited media folks into the event, you'll be banned from the con. So furry cons really started shifted to becoming a little bit more enclosed. And because of that, a lot of furry cons up until the recent time basically were stuck in a 90s science fiction con model, only modernizing after the furry fandom became a little bit more accepted. But so during this time, we had something called the comic boom and bust, where we had a speculators market trying to thinking comics were going to go up in price, and it didn't happen. So it caused an end of a lot of things. But this is also a period where we started to see more con groups in the vein of creation start forming. So, for example, Wizard Magazine bought Wizard Comic Con, and then San Diego, Chicago Comic Con, and rebranded as Wizard World Comic Con. They also bought Big Apple Comic Con later on, and Fan Expo bought Dallas Comic Con. Both of them tried to take over the market. So these are pro cons that are trying to take over the convention market. So, for example, Wizard World tried to host an event the same weekend as Heroes Con, but it resulted in a backlash by the comics talent that boycotted the event. And after Fan Expo bought Dallas Comic Con and rebranded as Fan Expo Dallas, they tried to hold it the same weekend as A-Con. So this is where I was starting to see a shift in how a lot of things are going. So like we were saying, the popular perception of these times, these conventions were for geeky, nerdy folks. I would say the shift kind of happened when Robert Downey Jr. makes it really started promoting Iron Man at Comic-Con, and all of a sudden we started to see. So before then, most of these cons were for talent within the science fiction and comic book industry, and while these are big name guys, most of the general public don't really care too much about comic book writers or science fiction authors. But Hollywood, when these big cons started inviting Hollywood actors, this is when the public kind of really took notice, and it really started to shift the perception of these conventions, where fan and geek culture was kind of like the in thing. And you really saw this because after Robert Downey Jr. Was promoting Iron Man at Comic-Con, the year after, you started seeing a spike in ticket sales to San Diego Comic-Con, to the point that nowadays it's near impossible to get a ticket to San Diego Comic-Con because they sell out within minutes. Wizard World, which was a magazine, and Reed Pop, which used to host business events, shifted to running cons full-time because they saw the potential for making money business out of these conventions. So you started seeing a lot of convention groups like Comic-Con International, Left Field Media, and Forma as well, professionally run con business models, which a lot of old guard con folks call cattle cons or profit cons, because as opposed to the casual nature of a lot of these old science fiction cons of the period, where it's just a bunch of folks and fans hanging out in a hotel bar and, maybe their favorite author or actor is there and they get to chat with them. A lot of these quote unquote cattle cons will just are basically giant autograph sessions where you just wait in line to get an autograph and you're shoved to another autograph line to get it autographed and you're shoved into a panel for a media announcement and you're shoved around. So most people didn't like this style of things. And you also see in a lot of video game events model themselves after these Comic Cons and shift from the trade show model they were used to be known for. This is around the same time of what's now known, a term I use called the animation revival with Adventure Time of My Little Pony, Lauren Faust's reboot of My Little Pony. Of course, what we now know as the Brony fandom started off with a bunch, specifically a lot of millennials on online groups trying to support Lauren Faust because Lauren Faust is a great animator. She worked on, the Iron Giant, Powerpuff Girls, Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. She was unfairly being treated for My Little Pony, so a lot of fans kind of rallied around her, and eventually the Brony fandom was formed. Purple Tinker, as someone in the chat mentioned, was one founded what's now known as the first BronyCon. BronyCon was founded as a hybrid between the guest of honor model that Star Trek cons had and the dealers and paneling areas of the furry cons. What happened, another con that happened was Las Pegasus Unicon. This almost brought the end to the PonyCon scene because we started to see a boom of pony conventions happening around the same time. At some points, we had I think almost 50 PonyCons happening in the country every year, with almost 3 PonyCons happening in every major state. So it kind of was kind of bad because the pony fandom, as opposed to the Star Trek fandom, which honors all different generations and franchises, the pony fandom really specifically focused on Gen 4. So if you stressed out the guests, then they probably will never want to come back to a pony convention. So because of that, the PonyCons then ended up with something called the VIP relations or the VIPR. So a lot of cons didn't really have a concept of treating guests of honor with respect. They mostly again used them as promoting autographs and panels and would shove them from event to event. So the idea of VIPR or VIP relations is to kind of treat these guests with more respect, make sure they're not overworked, and try to make sure they have a good time so they want to come back for the next year. So after Unicon, ponies adopted this model, and now a lot of cons, anime cons, comic cons, and furry cons now have a similar green room or guest relations department. Ponies also popularized a lot of other stuff. So pronoun ribbons, which were also something that furry cons started, became more popular especially since the pony scene, almost all the major pony cons were founded by trans individuals or run by trans individuals. So the introduction of gender neutral bathrooms is something that the pony cons started to do. And okay, so I just got word that I could take up to 15 minutes after if needed. All right, yeah, if I could get the extra 15 minutes, that would be great because I think I delayed things a little bit too much with that delay. So if we could get the extra 50 minutes, that'd be great. So PonyCons introduced the pronoun ribbons, or at least popularized them. Furrycons were doing that too. Gender neutral bathrooms and what's called communication tags. So let me show you the next page. So BronyCon was one of the first to do what's called a communication badge, which because a lot of people in the pony fandom, some a little bit antisocial or and we're not comfortable with talking with other people as much, or specifically talking with strangers. They were there specifically to meet fans. Okay, thank you for the extension. So they had these color-coded ribbons, badges that you could wear. So if it's green, strangers would know it's okay to come up and talk with you. If it's yellow, they understood that only friends can talk to that person. And if it's red, then don't bug the person. I think that's really, really great. And I think some cons start adapting this later on. So after Las Pegasus Unicon happened, we started seeing very, very similar things happen with events like TanaCon, DashCon, and Firefest. So with the concept of conventions becoming more and more popular, a lot of people were like, hey, we could run our own convent. And I think it has to do with the concept of being popular within the fandom. So within the furry fandom, I think a lot of us furries know the term poppy fur. And the brony fandom, the term is called horse famous. But there's the idea that you could become really, really famous in a small group of people. So for example, I'm a genetic biologist, and there's a lot of genetic biologists where I am. But if I go to a con and I'm known for something else, then I might like that a little bit better. So there's people who realize, oh, instead of I could be kind of a big fish in a small pond mentality. So the concept of trying to become famous within a small fandom really took hold around this time. Of course, it's always been the thing, but you could see it really intensify here. So normally it's the artists, YouTubers, fanfic writers, and musicians who would normally be horse famous or popular or trying to be popular within the fandom. But if you didn't really have talents in those creative areas, the default thing you could do is I could run a con. So there's this, I think it's a bad mentality that anyone can run a con. I really think people who have previous experience in event management and organization should be running cons. Or at least helping fan cons, because we started like what was happening with the Brony scene. We started seeing this boom of ponycons. Everyone, like all these high school kids and college students, they could make their own ponycons, and a lot of these ponycons crashed and burned right away. And while the pony scene kind of tightened up this explosion, you started to see a bunch of anime, comic, and furry cons really explode on the scene, trying to expand this notion. At the same time, we had these for-profit cons, these, like I said, the con business models expanding as well. So it kind of became a war between volunteer-run cons and for-profit cons or business cons. And a lot of these pro cons thought they could try to expand, reach bigger markets. So, for example, Oldacon tried to do Oldacon Vegas, West Coast version of that event, which didn't really work. PAX, of course, is famous for doing different variations of PAX around the country. Magfest also is trying to do Magfest West, and AwesomeCon attempted to do it, but it never followed through and they ended up having to cancel the events. So a lot of these cons thought we could make more money doing these businesses, and they tried to expand, and it really work. Around the same time, you saw a lot of entertainment companies trying to appeal to geek culture, which was the in thing now. So you started seeing the rise of things like Funko Pop and Loot Crates, trying to appeal to the geek market. A lot of YouTube channels and new media sites were based around just talking about fandoms and geek culture. So we really started seeing oversaturation of geek and fan culture. And around this time, like I was saying, furry cons were finally becoming more welcome. So while furry cons, I don't think were the first to do it. I'm sure they were probably one of the big cons to popularize doing charity auctions. I think it was a better way for furry cons to ingratiate themselves into the community, so people would know that furries are normal people that shouldn't be feared. So furry cons became a lot more open. So for example, we see the relationship with Anthrocon in Pittsburgh as I think a very nice close relationship. I even think Anthrocon in Pittsburgh has a closer relationship than Comic-Con with San Diego. But we started seeing furry cons becoming more open. Now that's the issue, because now all of a sudden the furry con attendance started booming up. So what's interesting is a lot of people consider bronies a subsection of the furry fandom, but BronyCon, it was the Brony convention scene that was the first to hit the 10K mark. It took a Midwest Fur Fest, I think, another few years before they finally hit the 10K mark. So furry cons are built around a small core group of the same volunteers year after year for a small 100 to a few thousand size attendees. So furry cons were not really well suited for the boom in attendance they saw, because like I was saying, because they isolated themselves for a period, a lot of furries were afraid of bringing on volunteers from outside the fandom, because there was a fear they'll be made fun of. So a lot of furry cons use models that worked in the 90s but doesn't really work in the modern era. So a lot of furry cons had to play catch up. So for example, registration, badge pickup, how dealers hall were run, how artist alleys were run, how panels were run. A lot of this stuff was almost like 10 years behind by the time the attendance spike started happening. So furry cons really had to get on that. So, for example, a lot of furry cons still use the first come, first serve method for dealer applications, which is a really bad method. I think so. Megaplex, this con that we're at now, actually uses that method, and I did explain to the chair and some other folks why it's a bad method. So it seems like they're expanding. So some furry cons are still modernizing, but some are still stuck in this old method. But yeah, a lot of the old traits like first come, first serve, and their badge pickup really needed to modernize. And I think Anthrocon was one. For example, their artist alley used the you had to like pay, you had to go up to a different register and pay before the artist could give you the art, and then the artist had to pick up the money at the end of the day. That was like a really outdated system that finally was modernized. So we see a lot of these cons modernizing, and this moves to the next period where we have So I kind of like so the start of this chapter. I used the science fiction novel "Ants Really Justice," which in 2013 won the Hugo Award, Nebula Award, and all the other major science fiction awards. And to a lot of more conservative factions within the science fiction fandom, they saw this as a more liberal SJW leftist leaning work, and they didn't like that more leftist. Fiction was winning the Hugo Awards. So a lot of the old school hard science fiction conservative side of the science fiction fandom formed what's called the Sad Puppies block voting method, where they'll specifically block vote conservative and more right wing or right leaning authors. For these award categories, this later inspired the Rabid Puppies movement, and around the same, I don't think it's a coincidence, but around the same time we had Gamergate, Comicgate, and the Me Too movement happening. And of course, this affected the convention scene because gaming and comics are integral to the Comic Cons and anime conventions. Um, and a lot of people who were frequent at these events, so like J.K. Rowling, Dan Harmon, James Gunn, ended up being called out for some of their problematic statements during the Me Too movement. So a lot of cons were forced to kind of ban individuals. And of course, one of the most famous examples of this is the Kick Fic movement with some anime cons blacklisting anime voice actor Vic Minoya for some of his, I guess, problematic past. So we started seeing this around the same time. And another example is DragonCon, one of the co-founders of DragonCon, which owned, I think, 1/3 of DragonCon around this time, was convicted of pedophilia. So since he owned 1/3 of the con, like the rest of the con had to buy him out of his share. And this stuff was just happening all around the scene. So we had, so furries and bronies, of course, had to address, I'm sure we all know more not nice elements of the fandom. So of course, Rocky Mountain FurCon was one of the main cons that got the spotlight during this period. So both the bronies and furries have been trying to, since they are the fandom as a whole is a little bit more progressive and left leaning. The concept of having these problematic figures in fandoms that should be embracing differences was seen as bad. So a lot of the cons had to close up or end. And because of that, we started to see a void. We started seeing a bunch of furry cons, like with the pony cons a few years earlier, where a bunch of pony cons boomed up. A bunch of furry cons started booming up to fill the void. So, for example, we had Corgi events, which created Denvers to fill the void that Rocky Mountain FurCon left. And they also created Painted Desert FurCon to counter the Arizona FurCon, which was run by anime con folks. And a lot of furries didn't think anime con folks could run furry cons as well. But we started seeing a lot of cons, furry cons pop up, and that also becomes an issue as well because a lot of these folks, a lot of these furry cons were also had rocky starts, like with the early pony cons, or were run by people who weren't furries. So I think Antler Northwest is an example of a con that's not really run by furries, and I think they got in trouble as well, since some of the people who were running that con were seen as a little bit more. They were called out for being more on the religious side and bringing. I think they had CNN come to the event and film attendees without the attendees really getting notice ahead of time. So yeah, so there's a lot of cons, and because you had a bunch of cons just forming, of course, there's going to be things that were overlooked, and during this period. And that shifts to the modern period that we have now. So last year, 2019, WorldCon held its 80th event. San Diego Comic-Con celebrated 50 years, and of course we had the final BronyCon. This year also wrapped up the first era of the Marvel Cinematic Universe with the Infinity Saga with Endgame. So we also had the domination of superhero comics and superhero franchise really dominating the entertainment scene, and this got called out by comic writer Alan Moore, as well as film directors Scorsese and Coppola, for saying it's a death of the cultural landscape. Of course, around the same time, we had San Diego Comic-Con and Salt Lake Comic-Con get into a naming lawsuit. So San Diego Comic-Con argued the term Comic-Con was their trademark and shouldn't be infringed. As a historian of these conventions, I would argue that Comic-Con is a general term, and I use Comic-Con as a general term to describe comic conventions. But San Diego Comic-Con ended up winning that lawsuit, so technically Comic-Con is owned by Comic-Con International, which runs San Diego Comic-Con. And so a lot of cons had to change their name from Comic-Con. Like Salt Lake Comic-Con and Phoenix Comic-Con had to change their names. I'm actually surprised, since I know Big Apple Comic-Con, New York Comic-Con, and Emerald City Comic-Con are all run by ReedPop, and they aren't. So it's a different company than Comic-Con International, but they're still able to use the term Comic-Con. So I'm not sure if they have an agreement with San Diego or not, but we saw that as kind of an issue. And then we shifted to, as someone was saying in the chat, MFF owns the term FurFest. And then that kind of makes more sense. Like if the term FurCon was copyrighted or trademarked, I would think there's issues. Like if the term AnimeCon and FurryCon were trademarked, I think that would be a bit of an issue for Fest. It kind of makes sense. In fact, if you look at the cons in the Chicago area, you have Midwest Pony Fest. So it seems like if you're in the Chicago area, you put Fest in your title. So yeah, that's why BronyCon actually really stood out, because BronyCon trademarked the name BronyCon, so none of the other PonyCons could use the term PonyCon, even though BronyCon kind of becomes synonymous, generalized term for when you're describing a My Little Pony convention. All right, so of course we had the coronavirus, which basically killed con season for 2020. RIP. So the Bronies were some of the earliest adopters of the first virtual con. So we had a con I used to run called ChocoCon, and you had Horses at Home. So this was years before coronavirus hit, but the Bronies were doing like these mini online events, which would have a lot of the same things that we are doing now, like digital panels and online stores and online commissions and draw streams. So a lot of cons, to try and make up for this, started shifting to having a digital convention. So we started having different cons. So of course we have Megaplex currently being hosted online. I guess it's weird because I noticed Megaplex does have a paywall. The other like San Diego Comic-Con and some of the pony conventions didn't have a paywall, but I guess the Megaplex one is going towards a charity, so that makes sense. But yeah, so a lot of cons started shifting to this online model, and it basically killed the season. So this is where I'm probably going to end my convention history book, because we don't know what's going to happen. For the most part, the convention scene has been changed. For the better or worse, we don't know. But I don't think conventions will be the same as they were. If they go back to normal, or if not, this 2020 is going to be a year that really shifts all this stuff. So like I said, if you guys are interested, check out my stuff. I just got a new website called Con History. My email is conhistory@gmail.com. You can follow con updates on Twitter on Con History, and my YouTube is Con History. And if you guys have any questions, I'm sorry I wasn't able to answer any questions, but if you guys actually want to leave questions, as long as this chat room I think is open, or if you guys want to message me directly, my Telegram is just Choco Pony. Actually, let me type it in the chat so you guys can message me. If you guys have any questions about anything I was covering, feel free to message me. I'm selling this exclusive pin to help raise money for the book. It's a Con Season 2020 on a tombstone. And with that, I think that's it. Yeah, thank you very much for joining the panel. And I hope you have a really good time at for the rest of your con. Tomorrow I'm doing an anime transformation panel. So if you guys are interested, be sure to check that out. And with that, if you guys have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat, and I'll try to answer them until I have to go. Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, I hope you guys are are having a good time so far. Actually, just curious, are any folks who were listening to my panel, or any folks out there, do you guys consider yourself old guard or gray muzzles, like folks who are been in the con scene for a while now? I'm just kind of curious how many folks are out there, because that's the thing. We see we have like what's called the old school science fiction fandom that or furry fandom that see themselves as the old guard of the old fandom, and it's a very very nice dichotomy because we could see how things evolved since those early days and how they kind of brought up to now. All right, let's see. Question. All right. So moderator asked a question. I feel like what's next for conventions are a fight between real convention hosts versus online conventions. Do you feel they will lose some traffic in the future because of the rise of online cons? How do you predict this? Okay, so if you guys, yeah, so I did my first answer. So I'll probably link the video in here. But the panel I did for PonyFest Online, which was the first online convention of 2020 after coronavirus hit, someone asked me the exact same question, and my answer was I was already predicting cons would move to a more online model, but I didn't think it would happen this fast. Mainly, there were some elements. So first, the main reason most people go to cons is to interact with people who are in the professional industry. And aside from sending fan letters back in the day, the only real place you could do this is at conventions. That's the draw of conventions. But I was realizing with Twitter, like you could get into fights with like William Shatner, for example, on Twitter. So the closeness, the exclusivity of cons, interacting with folks being at cons was no longer the case. The other thing I was thinking was the rise of VR, virtual reality. So I was thinking cons would shift to like a Ready Player One situation where, as opposed to wearing cosplay or fursuits, you could actually be your own persona. You could be your own OC in this virtual world and interact with people, shop from online stores. And there was a PonyCon, a virtual PonyCon that happened, I think a few months ago. I think it was called Sea Pony Fest, but they basically had, and their entire virtual con was held in Minecraft. So you could go into Minecraft and see these virtual, like they had literal panel rooms where each panel room had a giant screen which live streamed to its own unique panel. So they basically mocked up the entire experience of going to a con, meeting other people, going to these panel rooms and shopping at booths. It had like digital vendor booths. It was fantastic. So I don't think furry cons, I don't think online cons will overtake at-person cons. But I do think we will probably see a shift to more online cons, and a lot of these larger cons will kind of consolidate. And I think with that concludes my time. So thank you guys very much. Feel free to message me on Telegram if you have any questions. And let me just quickly link my. If you guys missed the panel that I did at PonyCon, let me link it to you guys. And here we go. So this panel is my PonyFest panel that I also did at San Diego Comic-Con. It breaks down my book chapter by chapter. So if you guys are more interested in that, be sure to check that out. With that, thank you very much. Go support the artists out there. Go support vendors. Check out my store. With that, thank you guys very much. Have a good time. Rest of your time here at this event.